Namaskar, students. I hope and pray that all of you are all safe and healthy. In today's session, we will be discussing literary features of the Victorian age. Now, in today's session, I am only going to discuss the genre of poetry. In the coming session, I will be discussing prose, which includes both fiction and non-fiction. Victorian age is not renowned for drama. Majorly, it was poetry and prose which was supported and written during the Victorian age. So let's begin. Characteristics of the Victorian poetry. Victorian poetry is dominated by stalwarts such as Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the wife of Robert Browning, and the Pre-Raphaelite poets. Victorian poetry settles between romanticism and realism. Victorian poetry finds itself between this space left by the romantic poets and the advent of modernism or realism. So Victorian poetry is somewhere between them, is somewhere between the extreme romanticism of the 18th century, late 18th and the early 19th century, and the crude realism of the modern age. Victorian poetry used several themes, which we will be discussing in details. There are various styles which are also evident in Victorian poetry. It used moral tone. Victorian poetry differed in the way how nature was represented in Romantic age. We will see how nature was represented in Victorian age in detail. It was a little melancholic in nature, a little pessimistic, sad in nature as compared to Romantic age. The anxiety over science, the conflict between science and religion is evident in Victorian age. Last, Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I will be discussing all these points in detail in today's session. Themes. So on what themes was generally Victorian poems during the Victorian age were written? There were myriad subjects on which Victorian poetry was written, beginning with poems written about the poor and middle class condition. Alfred Lord Tennyson and Matthew Arnold especially incorporated the poor and middle class conditions in their poems. Subjects also included the condition of women. Now there are a few poems that I will cite to explain this point. One of the poems is The Lady of Shalott, written by Alfred Lord Tennyson. The other poem from where I have used a quotation, The Princess, is also written by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now what Alfred Lord Tennyson writes in this poem, The Princess: man for the field and woman for the hearth, house. Man for the sword, for the needle, she. Man with the head and woman with the heart. Man to command and woman to obey. All else confusion. There were strict norms, strict rules and regulations of how a woman is supposed to behave in a society. These norms, these regulations is reflecting here in this quote by Tennyson in the poem The Princess. I have also included a very interesting poem and a heavily criticized poem also titled Angel in the House by Coventry Patmore. Virginia Woolf, the famous modern age novelist, she criticized this poem heavily in her essays. What Coventry Patmore has written in this long narrative poem, and I have only used an excerpt from his poem. And he writes, man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure. Down the gulf of his condoled necessities, she casts her best, she flings herself. Now, in the same stanza, after a few lines, Coventry Patmore writes, she loves with love that cannot tire. She loves with love that cannot tire. She's tireless in loving her husband. The poem talks about the relationship of a couple, husband and a wife. And through this poem, Coventry Patmore has talked about the typical relationship of a husband and wife during the Victorian age. She loves with love that cannot tire. And when, woe, she loves alone, through passionate duty, love springs higher as grass grows taller round a stone. Even during a problem or a misunderstanding that erupts between a husband and a wife, even if a husband's love is less, he is not able to shower love more towards his wife. The wife is supposed to keep loving her husband higher and higher. She loves alone. So this poem also talks about a typical domestic setting during the Victorian age. The title of the poem is Angel in the House. So she's supposed to stay inside the house, inside the four walls of the house. She's supposed to be selfless. She's supposed to be generous. She's supposed to love and take care of her family, irrespective of how the family behaves with her. So these are several aspects reflected in the poems written during Victorian age. They represent the condition of women during the Victorian age. Next, there were poems which were written on the aspect of democracy and patriotism. The Charge of the Light Brigade, a famous poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and also The Patriot by Robert Browning. They showcase the element of patriotism as well as democracy, which was growing during the Victorian age. Victorian age was also growing in terms of imperialism, in terms of the nations that England was colonizing. There were also poems which showcased conflict between religion and science. One famous poem to quote regarding this point is Matthew Arnold's Tower Beach. I have I have taken a stanza to explain this point about conflict between religion and science. And Matthew Arnold beautifully portrays this conflict in the following words: the sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore. The sea of faith, which means the element of faith, the belief that people had in God, in the existence of God, that was full. Once that was full and round earth's shore. It lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now, in the past, belief, faith, people had a strong belief in the existence of God. People had huge faith in the existence of God. But now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating. Earlier, earlier it was full. Earlier it was the sea was full and it surrounded the earth's shore. Right now, the sea is withdrawing and retreating to the breath of the night wind. Down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Just like we have tides and ebbs, the faith in the existence of God is dwindling. A very apt quotation to, uh, to showcase the conflict between religion and science. Moving ahead, what were the different styles that Victorian poets used in their poems? Now, Victorian poets experimented a lot in terms of styles and meters. There were sonnets which were written. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she contributed a lot. She wrote a famous sonnet collection titled Sonnets from the Portuguese. So sonnets were written, lyrical poems were also written. Both Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning, they wrote lyrical poems, narrative poems, dramatic monologues. Robert Browning is considered as the father of dramatic monologue. Also, ballads were written during the Victorian age. Victorian poetry was dominated by element of morality. There was a heavy moral tone in poems. In the poems of Alfred Lord Tennyson and Matthew Arnold, both these poets, they heavily included morality in their poems. Moral tone is less observed in the poems of Robert Browning as compared to Tennyson and Matthew Arnold. Both these poets, both these major poets, Tennyson and Matthew Arnold, they wrote with a moral purpose. They saw the ills in the society. They observed how society was getting corrupted, whether it's because of advancement of science or modernization. And hence, whatever they viewed as ills of society, whatever they viewed as corruption in society, they wanted to reform it. Which is why their poems are heavily infused with morality. Poems also talked about etiquette. Remember the previous quotation of the princess? How a woman is supposed to behave, social norms, behavior. There was a movement, a religious movement called Oxford Movement, which took place during the Victorian age. Oxford Movement was all about trying to bring back credibility to religion. So Oxford Movement was also a very famous movement that used morality in the poems, nature, representation of nature. As compared to the romantic poets who glorified nature in their poems, it is not observed that such glorification, such level, such extent of glorification is observed in the Victorian age poetry. The dominant poets, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Thomas Hardy, also, all these poets, they represented nature, they showcased nature in their poems, but nature is not excessively glorified as it was glorified during the Romantic age. Tennyson has represented nature in his very famous poem titled In Memoriam AHH. Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold is another famous poem where nature is represented. If you talk about Robert Browning, Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came, another poem of him, which describes nature apparently, but it describes the barren wasteland. If we compare the romantic poets with Victorian poets, this is a very nice observation. In a sense that when William Wordsworth, who used to revere nature as a teacher, Tennyson considered nature as red in tooth and claw. Tennyson observed in his poems that nature is a fierce entity, is a brutal force, is a powerful entity capable of destroying everything. So he viewed nature as if it is red in tooth and claw. Hardy's poems, they portray nature induced with pessimism. Hardy, who is more famous as a novelist, Thomas Hardy, he also wrote a few poems. But just as his novels, most of his poems are also induced with pessimism, with sadness, with isolation. And he has represented nature also in a negative sense, in a pessimistic sense. Melancholia. In the poems written by Victorian poets, it is evident that such characteristics such as pessimism, despair, melancholia, isolation, alienation are all heavily observed in their poetry. Whether we take the example of In Memoriam AHH, AHH stands for Arthur Henry Hallam, who was the best friend of Tennyson. And Tennyson lost his friend in an accident. The whole poem, In Memoriam, is comprised of his memories, his lamentations, his observation about nature, about life, death. And so the poem is heavily dominated by melancholy. Matthew Arnold's poem Scholar Gypsy and also Dover Beach talk about the advancement or modernization and how advancement of science or modernization affects the society, which is again melancholic. Both these poems are melancholic in nature, and so are the poems of Thomas Hardy. Melancholy towards the advancement and modernized Victorian society is what they demonstrated in their poems. Change, when we talk about change, it is always difficult for any individual to accept the change. Victorian society was changing in terms of advancement of science, in terms of changing from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. The beliefs and faith of people were changing, and so this change was difficult to accept during that time. Melancholy is a very dominant aspect in the poems of Victorian age. Anxiety over science and religion. After the publication of Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species, which tried to challenge the existing theory that human beings are the creation of God, it challenged the age-old notion, the age-old belief and tried to prove that human beings have evolved from apes. It's a theory of evolution that Charles Darwin talked about in his work. And it's not only this single work that tried to shake the foundations, that tried to shake the beliefs of people, but apart from it, there were several different works, scientific works, which were published at that time. And collectively, all these scientific works, they played a huge role in terms of creating anxiety, in terms of creating conflict between science and religion. There was constant conflict between science and religion. Faith in people was shaken. Till now, whatever they believed, till now, whatever was written in Bible, their beliefs, the things written in Bible were challenged. So there were several scientific advancements, inventions, and discoveries that took place during the Victorian age. England demonstrated its superiority in the Great Exhibition of London, which happened in 1851. And England showcased its superiority in front of the world through that exhibition. So several scientific advancements, inventions, and discoveries, all these aspects, all such advancement of science, it played a role in challenging the conventions, the beliefs, the faith that religion had instilled in people. Another aspect that created anxiety was that dispute between different Christianity sects. Different Christianity sects had their own disputes, which increased the tension in people. My last point in today's session is about the Pre-Raphaelite poets. Pre-Raphaelite poets were a group of artists, secret group of artists. The group comprised of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, D.G. Rossetti, William Michael Rossetti, who was his brother, Thomas Woolner, William Holman Hunt, Frederick George Stephens, James Collinson, and John Everett Millais. Now this group of artists, they were revolting against the current art establishment. They were revolting against how art was showcased and how art was politicized during that time. They revolted against the British Royal Academy and its approach to art instruction. The group had their own agendas, that is, to have genuine ideas to express, to study nature attentively so as to know how to express them, to produce thoroughly good pictures. To produce thoroughly good pictures. Dante Gabriel Rossetti is a very famous poet and an artist also, who has written both poem as well as painting. A very famous work of Dante Gabriel Rossetti is the Blessed Damozel. There is a painting, and accompanying the painting is also a poem. Please go through and Google this particular work in order to know how good he was as an artist and also as a poet. So to produce thoroughly good pictures and statues, emphasis was on beautiful and sensuous detail. Sensuous detail. During the Victorian age, when there were strict rules and regulations, an allegation was levied on them, and Pre-Raphaelites were considered as fleshly school of poetry, because their poems, their paintings did not hesitate in showcasing sensual aspects, bodily aspects of human beings. Symbolic meaning associated with common objects and situations. So the group thought about symbolic meaning associated with common objects or situations. Feelings of nostalgia for a dream-like medieval world. Their poems, their paintings went back during the medieval world, and they used melodious language. So students, we have taken an overview about various characteristics, various aspects related to Victorian poetry. We do not have Victorian poetry in a sense. We do not have only Victorian poetry. Excuse me. Collectively, we are supposed to write an answer about characteristics of Victorian literature, which includes all genres which were written during that time. Today, I have focused on poetry. In the next session, I will be focusing on prose, both fiction as well as non-fiction. Please take care of yourselves. Thank you.